Alright, here we go. We're going to work on the, this is Precal, the mid Chapter 6 test for 25, 26, and 27. Okay, so when we're doing this, we're taking a look at the reference angles as they're being created, right? From as it's going around and around and around the unit circle. So as this angle is going around the unit circle, it creates a different opposite side, but the hypotenuse always stays the same, because the hypotenuse is the radius of the circle, right? So the hypotenuse, if we think about it, goes to the radius. That's the hypotenuse, right? But then, am I recording? Let's make sure. Yeah. So, but then the reference angle is referencing to the x. Okay? So it always creates this opposite side and this adjacent side. Okay? As it continues around the circle. Now, when it hits certain spots, that would be the x-axis or the y-axis, right? Some funky things happen. What happens is the triangle collapses. Okay? And what we want to talk about, what happens as the triangle collapses. So on this left side, the triangle is collapsing down, and this opposite side is becoming 0 as we get to right here, as we get to this point, right? But the adjacent side becomes the same length as the hypotenuse. And in this case, because this is negative, right? The hypotenuse is going to be -1. And the adjacent side is also going to be -1. Okay? So that's what's happening when it hits this point. Now, as we're going up and we're hitting this point, you'll notice that now the adjacent side is hitting 0. Right? The adjacent side is getting smaller. And the opposite side is becoming the size of the hypotenuse. But in this case, it's not negative anymore, because going up is positive, right? So this should be 1 and 1. As we come over to this side, as we get to this point, right? The opposite is going to 0, right? So again, let's put these adjacent, opposite, hypotenuse. And the opposite's going to 0, but the adjacent's becoming 1, and the hypotenuse is always 1, right? And then with this guy, as we're coming down to this point, the opposite side is becoming, so we're going to go adjacent, opposite, hypotenuse, right? And the adjacent side is becoming 0, right? The opposite side is becoming 1, and the hypotenuse is still, becoming -1, because in this case, it's negative, right? So, down here is negative, so it's going to be -1. So, you'll see that when we're talking up or down, we're either talking the opposite side's negative or the opposite side's positive. If we're talking right to left, we're talking that the adjacent's positive or the adjacent's negative. Okay? And so that makes it really easy for us to do these problems. Because now I just have to look at where these points are. Because this point's right here, it went around twice, it's negative. But all we care about is, where is this point? That point is this guy, right? So we're going to be using this adjacent, opposite, and hypotenuse. So we're going to be using adjacent equals 0, opposite equals -1, and hypotenuse equals -1. And then all we do is say, okay, what's cotangent? Well, cotangent is A over O, right? AO, right? So the cotangent of -450 is equal to A, or 0, over O, which is -1. And 0 divided by -1 is 0. So the cotangent is 0 in this case. Okay? In the next problem, we're in the same spot, so we're going to use the same adjacent. Even though we got there in a different direction, it's the same spot. So we use the same numbers, right, for adjacent, opposite, and hypotenuse, except now we're talking about secant, right? And C can't be a ho, so she's a ha, right? So that means H over A. So the secant of 270, right, is H, which is -1, over A, which is 0. But you can't have 0 in the bottom, so it's undefined. So in this case, the secant of 270 is undefined. Okay? Now we look at cosine. Okay? Now this one's a little different. You'll notice that we're talking about going around and ending up here. So now we're talking about this one. Right? So with this guy, we're talking about the adjacent being 0, the opposite being 1, and the hypotenuse being 1. And so now we can say, well, okay, the cosine of -630 is equal to, cosine is equal to ca, or A over H, and A is 0, and H is 1. So the cosine of -630 is equal to 0. And that's how we go about those problems. How does that look? Is that better than yesterday? A little fast, but hopefully makes sense.